Right. Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Sun is out, so I don't, like influence of the mood. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Atalia Omer. I'm professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Koch Institute for International Peace Studies at the Trio School for the last 4 years. And I'm also co-directing Contending Modernities together with Dean Scott Appleby, who is here, and colleague Professor Ibrahim Musa, who will be here today. And it's on behalf of the Contending Modernities and the Koch Institute, and also with co-sponsorship with the Levinas Institute for European Studies and the Initiative on Race. So thank you to Mark Sanders and Clement Stadman for also helping us to spread the word about this really generative conversation here with Professor Nelson Maldonado-Torres. So Professor Nelson Maldonado-Torres is a professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, but he is also so much more than that. He is co-chair of the Fanon Foundation and president emeritus of the Caribbean Philosophical Association. He served in that capacity from 2008 to 2013. He's also a professor extraordinarius at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences, University of South Africa, and honorary professor at the University of KwaZulu, Natal, in Durban. His publications include dozens of articles and book chapters on his main research areas, which include theories of modernity and coloniality, and decoloniality, Africana philosophy, Caribbean, Latin America, and Latinx philosophy, philosophy of race, philosophy of religion, philosophy of the human sciences, with a particular attention to ethnic studies and related fields. His research is also intersecting with political philosophy, here with a particular attention to movement-generated theory, organizing in action, phenomenology, philosophy of psychology, and liberation ethics. So that's a really giant portfolio. He also authored or edited many books in multiple languages, including of a particular relevance for us at the Koch Institute. I believe it's the first book, Against War, Views from the Underside of Modernity, that was published by Duke University Press in 2008. So now that the CV part of the introduction is over, and before we turn to the main event, I just want to share that the scholarship of Professor Maldonado-Torres has deeply influenced me as someone rooted in the philosophy of religion. Maldonado-Torres published a piece in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion in 2014 that illuminates how the construction of religion as a comparative anthropological category was co-constitutive with the construction of race as a category in the modern colonial moment of 1492, and the systems of racialization on which coloniality has depended. Not often do I experience kind of wow moments when reading academic essays, but on those rare occasions, when I do, it is really incredible and generative and something that should be celebrated. And with this, we in Contending Modernity, we want to bring Nelson to our community that we understand really broadly. And so we hosted a blog. We have a really robust blog as part of Contending Modernities. And in the blog, we really try to think together with many interlocutors about what does it mean to think along decolonial lines in the study of religion and modernity. And of course, we asked Nelson to be our inaugural contributor. So the theory grew and generated a lot of interest, and has also proved effective in the classroom to really kind of teach students to grapple with the category of religion as it intersects with other categories and with questions of violence, and potentially also transforming various modalities of violence as they intersect with one another. So really with this, we have it's such an honor and privilege to welcome Professor Maldonado-Torres in person, not only on the blog, to our community here at Notre Dame. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omer, for the very kind and generous introduction. It is my great pleasure to finally meet you, to meet Joshua, who have been working at among so many of the things that they do, the Contending Modernities blog. I feel privileged to participate in that space, which is already constituting an archive for reflections on the study of religion, the study of modernity and different forms, theories of modernity, approaches to Western modernity, and to also the question of coloniality and decolonization. And so that is becoming a rich resource, right? And I just wonder how, what would it have been if when I was a student, so, a platform like that was present. I was in my PhD in the Department of Religious Studies. So I opted now more and more these days. I introduce my talks with an epigraph or more, and sometimes these epigraphs are poetic or visual or text. And so today I want to open with a longer than usual epigraph, which is a video. Maybe it will be about 6.5 minutes long, but it will speak to part of what I'm going to say today, and it will speak to part of the conversation tomorrow. And it may sound strange at first. I think by the end of the talk, I think it will make sense, because it's about deformation. It's about ethnic studies as an area, right? But as an area that has been dedicated to, quote unquote, decolonize the university. So we're going to be talking about peace, the coloniality of peace and justice, and countering that. And you will see how, I see ethnic studies as a space that where this kind of action, decolonization, countering the coloniality of a number of concepts and ideas and histories and archives and memory takes place. Right? And so I want to share with you what for those of us who were working, this is back in 2010 at the University of California, Berkeley. University of California, Berkeley was one of the first academic spaces with an ethnic studies department, and emerged out of student mobilization, student activism. That is, ethnic studies emerged in spite of the established university, not because of the university so important, right? So, and it took place, this student strike was called the Third World Strike. It was led by a student movement. They call themselves the Third World Liberation Front. And one of the kind of, I think, very incredible contributions of this coalition of students is that this emerged in the height of ethno-nationalisms in the US, right? In the height of that moment, where different groups were having kind of different nationalistic imaginaries about how to constitute themselves in resistance to US liberal politics. And so in the height of that moment of nationalism, they found the ground of coming together as a coalition, and they became the Third World Liberation Front, right? Participants there included the first Black Student Union in the US. The first Black Student Union emerged in the San Francisco State University. And you will see in the video will culminate when the first president of the Black Student Union back then in the late 60s, right, who participated in the strike. This strike was the longest student strike in the United States until about 2010. Actually, a little bit 2010, 2011. A little bit before, when we did the video, I think it was the longest student strike in the US. Now, what since then became the longest student strike, and think about the significance of this, took place, it was also led by other quote-unquote students of color. Not now in continental US, but in US in a US territory/colony of Puerto Rico. So the longest student strike in the US, including its territories, has taken place in Puerto Rico. But prior to that, it was this strike that you're going to see more about now. This is a few minutes of a video, 20-something minutes video that was prepared after the 40th anniversary of the Ethnic Studies Department, after the birth of the Ethnic Studies Department. And it was an intergenerational group of students, faculty, alumni, and then grad students, undergraduates, and also other faculty. So without further ado, let me put this. I want you to think about then, when we talk about countering the coloniality of something, to some extent, we're talking or in the path of talking about decolonizing something. And this conference is about decolonizing the university. So what, try to get what is then decolonization, how the concept is being mobilized here. But also think about what does it mean to come together as collectives, as multiracial collectives, in a particular moment with a particular agenda to achieve something. And what I want to suggest from the start is that if there is something like decolonial peace, PEACE, it will be found. Not the examples won't be found necessarily in examples of, in moments of quietness and solitude, but in moments of these kind of connections and organizing. So maybe the heart of the colonial peace is in the countering of the coloniality, of the violence that we all face. And so the ethnic studies in that view could be seen as a result of this kind of decolonial peace that turns into direct action in any particular context. So Joshua, can you help me? Yes. Technical assistance. A younger me will appear at the start.
Calinda, golpe tuyo calinda, que la bomba va a sonar. Golpe tuyo calinda, con barriles, con lo cual. Golpe tuyo.
The Decolonizing University Conference is the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Department of Ethnic Studies. And what we're doing in the conference is, on the one hand, yes, celebrating the space that professors and faculty in ethnic studies occupy, the place where we feel honored to work and serve, but also it is a time to look ahead. To look ahead, on the one hand, in the context of the current struggle against the investment on public education, and on the other hand, to look ahead in the sense of looking to the next 40 years of transformations in ethnic studies scholarship and in the university at large. So in a way, we are both celebrating and looking ahead, and for that we have brought activists and leaders that were crucial to make ethnic studies a reality 40 years ago. They are here in the conference. Also, other students who, during the process, also felt the need to organize, to impact the university, to take ethnic studies at different points out of different crises. So those students, a number of them, are here as well. And we have experts also in scholarly work. We have artists, we have poets, we have poetry going on in different panels, intersected with scholarly works. We have also a number of participants are presenting spirituality and doing workshops on the topic. And we have the more traditional scholarly reflection and scholarly panel that also we consider vital and important for what we're trying to imagine, which is a decolonized university represented in what we're calling the Third World College. A decolonized university will be about forming a different kind of subject, so as to be able to form a different kind of society. And that's what we're meaning by decolonization. Doesn't mean going back to the 1960s, to the 19th century. Doesn't mean that we're equally colonized in that way, but it means, though, that we still live in a web of relations of power that pretty much maintain a logic of colonization, and that they keep targeting some of the same typical communities, some of the very communities that were once literally colonized.
This morning, I want to propose to you that the term decolonial is a description, a declaration, and most importantly, a call to action. That by denying what we are not, we are also proclaiming what we are. By denying the colonized knowledges of those who have destroyed our communities, we are simultaneously declaring the value of new knowledges, particularly those from the lived experiences of our ancestors, our families, communities, and ourselves. It is an affirmation of our lived history, shared stories, healing processes, and our continued struggles.
I see decolonization in terms of really the inseparability of racism, ethnicity, gender, sexualities, and I think that it's important to have a feminist and queer perspective on decolonization, which the conference definitely had.
People here have been really challenging the concept of university and what does it mean to decolonize it, and so that it wasn't a celebration as if we had decolonized anything. It was more of still an aspiration, a hope, a vision, a dream.
Before we can decolonize the university, we have to decolonize society, and before decolonizing society, we have to actually decolonize ourselves.
Whenever we talk about the Third World Strike at SF State and the Third World Strike at UC Berkeley, we always think of it as two different strikes, but actually, if you really look at it, it was one strike. The Third World Strike, it was a movement, and that's where you get that relentlessness, people willing to continue to move on, to suffer whatever consequences, for a larger goal and larger unity.
I mean, when we started the strike, it was always from a much broader revolutionary perspective of what will help the oppressed in the world, and particularly at that time with the war in Vietnam and Indochina. Whatever votes we took about even ending the strike or accepting the terms of the university was from what would the Vietnamese want us to do, what would help them in their struggle to kick out the U.S. aggressors in their country.
So you could say that the strikes at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley were creating centers of resistance, But after these strikes had subsided and we were entering more of a phase of negotiations, for monies, budgets, FTEs, etc., that new centers of resistance began to evolve.
We felt the Third World experience was, is, and should be part of the whole American experience and education, and not a token niche degree. And so that's why we came up with the idea of having our own Third World College that would free us from their control, that we would be free to determine our own cultures and traditions and set up our own agenda.
I think the dream of having a Third World College is part of solving the problem. At San Francisco State, there is a School of Ethnic Studies, and there are still problems that I've talked about that still exist. But I think that a school is a step that perhaps that will make it easier, but I think we still have to deal with programs that address the problem, and that is producing smart, sharp students, but also problem solvers that are not just going to get a paycheck, but also to uplift their communities.
We're making the statement that
my time at UC Berkeley actually was very significant and formative for me. often say that when I get there, and I did my degree, as I was saying, in religious studies, and I was in a way escaping the narrow confines of institutionalized philosophy departments, and found religious studies to be offering me a broader ground, and it did. And then on that basis, I engaged also with other forms of interdisciplinary work, like Africana studies, when I was in graduate school. But when I was at Berkeley, I discovered it was kind of an entire new layer of ideas, and partly it came because of the embeddedness of what ethnic studies means there with this history of struggle. And there are multiple ways and ramifications of this. And I felt that I had a kind of another PhD that, it's possible. Something else wouldn't be necessarily a PhD, that would be the appropriate qualification, but you know what I kind of mean. So sometimes, that I think not recognize enough with the fundamental and the contributions of this space to the US Academy. And I think that in a number of decades, possibly, when the history of the university look back and see the greatest moments in the history of the university, that we're going to see in the United States one of those great moments, and it has to do, again, some innovations that took place in spite of the institution, and because of this mobilization and this innovation. So I want to say, as you know, I'm going to talk about the countering the coloniality of peace and justice, and I want to say from the outset that I do not consider myself a specialist in peace studies or in justice studies. So I come from acknowledging that position. Now, as someone who works on the question of colonization, coloniality, and decoloniality, then these are areas that are very much relevant to what I do, but I do not specialize in them. Now, I have in different moments of my work, I have reflected or written about them more than others. And coming here made me look back and identify two moments that I want to share with you, where in my work I have kind of engaged to see these ideas can offer some possibility for rich discussion and for more productive and generative ideas. And so one has to do with the book that Professor Omer mentioned, which is entitled Against War. This is a book from 2008. And the other ones are more recent, from 2020, in the context of Black Lives Matter. Right? So let me take half of the presentation, maybe focusing on that first half, is a kind of a review of some ideas, particularly about peace, as they are appearing against war, but also I'm taking it as an opportunity to somehow reformulate. I would not say things in the same way 15 years after, right? So in a way, it's a kind of a reformulation to some extent of some of the ideas that are there. So now, if you think about this title, Against War, you cannot avoid considering that against war may mean a different name for peace. Yet the title reads Against War and not For Peace. To some extent, it is fine. I think that that's correct to maintain the differentiation. But of course, the book and the text is deeply invested in trying to figure out, in a way, what also peace is. Now, the book starts, even in the introduction, bringing up the topic of peace in relation to war. And I want to read you some sentences from the introduction. This is so that you have a sense of what I'm trying to convey with the idea of being against war and what I mean by war. So the text reads, Friedrich Nietzsche once asserted that, quote, the normal state of things is war, and that man is by nature destined to only want peace rarely and for brief periods. The history of the 20th century and already the beginning of the 21st century will no doubt seem to provide evidence to Nietzsche's dictum. And I mentioned the Holocaust, wars of decolonization throughout the globe, the Cold War, ethnic cleansing, and so on. Then it continues the figures whose work I examine in the text do not believe that war is the normal conditions of human beings, but they do not accept the idea that war is a normal state of humanity either. On the contrary, their work helps us to determine first the roots of violence in the modern world, and second, whether or not human beings could reasonably aspire to peaceful modes of coexistence. Against War is a critical intervention in this context that seeks to illustrate the contributions of subaltern perspectives of religious thought to the overcoming of a widespread and influential Western paradigm of war, close quote. So the figures whose work are explored in Against War are Emmanuel Levinas, Enrique Dussel, and Franz Fanon. As you might know, Levinas was a Jewish European philosopher, Enrique Dussel is a Catholic Latin American philosopher, and Fanon is an Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist, philosopher, and militant in the Algerian Liberation Front. Of the three, he might be the only one considered a quote-unquote atheist. And I mean the quotes. With these three figures, I think that these three combination of figures in the text, what I was trying to do at least three things. One was to cross the lines between the religious and secular philosophical thought. Right? Second, desegregate the domains of theory and transcend the limits of area studies by connecting the thoughts and building from contributions from a European, a Latin American, and Afro-Caribbean thinker. Right? So this is space and the spatial geopolitical divides, and also the religious secular divide, and trying to kind of challenge those boundaries in the text. But there was another reason why this combination. The three of them had faced, were linked, or had an intimate knowledge of some of the most violent tendencies in the history of Western modernity. Levinas, who witnessed and lost great part of her family during the Holocaust in the Second World War. Dussel, who also, the three of them lived through the context of the Second World War, and they saw in one way, from close or from afar, the Holocaust and the devastation of the Second World War. Now, Dussel, also coming from Latin America, he was also intimately acquainted with the conditions of massive poverty in the region and the ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples. And then Fanon, he not only looked from afar, Fanon actually joined the French resistance against the Nazis. And in Black Skin, White Mass, he says that he escaped when he was 18 years old in his native island of Martinique to Guadeloupe to then go to North Africa. And he said that partly was because of his brother, the Jew. There was a connection there. He also wrote that MSSR taught him that an anti-Semite was also anti-Black person. And so he joins them. He's a veteran of that war, of the Second World War. Now, he also knew about the conditions of poverty in the Caribbean and of the kind of resilient colonization that existed in the region. Martinique was a colony then, and now it's a département of France. And he came from a Black majority island in the Caribbean, an island that went through both the genocide of indigenous peoples who were there, and the retransplantation via racialized slavery in the Middle Passage of West African peasants made into Caribbean subjects. Right. He was also, as I was going to comment further, I comment on this a little bit later on, he was also acquainted with how torture was so crucial in the projects of war, particularly by treating torture Algerians in the context of the Algerian revolution, because Fanon at the end, while he fought with the French against the Nazis, he fought with the Algerian against the French. Now, each of these figures, I argue, contribute something important, different to understanding, I think, of peace and justice ultimately. Now, for reasons of time, I will only focus on Levinas and Fanon, just to identify some key points. And one point is that Levinas is critical not only of fascism, of course, he would have been critical of fascism in that context, but also of liberalism. The philosophical anthropology, he criticizes the philosophical anthropology of liberalism based on the abstract individual, on individual rights and individual self-interests, translated into a reification of the values of self-interest and indifference toward the other. The affirmation of the primacy of self-interest and indifference toward the other lead to a certain tolerance of systemic violence. Once you are so tolerant to systemic violence, that becomes the slippery slope towards fascism. In my chapter on Levinas, I highlight how Levinas the supposed opposition between liberalism and fascism. Now, Levinas also provides something else, which is an account of subjectivity that is premised on the fundamental character of non-indifference towards the other. And this non-indifference is expressed in an ethical manner as a donation of the self, as a gift of the self to another. Now, this is captured by a couple of lines in the text, and the text reads, and again, I want to highlight this reference to peace. According to Levinas, the opposite of war is not the rational peace of the simultaneity in which subjects are indifferent to each other, but goodness, non-indifference, or the one for the other. This is for him the true character of co-fraternity. Now, Fanon, after the 2 chapters on Levinas, the book has 2 chapters on Fanon, in which I aim to offer a Levinasian reading of Fanon that responds to the limits or problems that I find in Levinas's work. Let me highlight the points that are most relevant to the question of war, peace, and the third term that is key in the text, decolonial love. I present Fanon as a philosopher of love, and here Levinas's work was as fundamental as the work of Sheila Sandoval in Methodology of the Oppressed. Reading Fanon as a philosopher of love was a way to go against the still strong current of scholarship that has approached Fanon as a philosopher of violence. As you're familiar with Fanon's Pressure of the Earth, you know that the first chapter is a long reflection about the meaning of violence and its role in the struggle for decolonization. Now, my argument is that Fanon was, and what I wrote there, was engaging in a war against war, oriented by love, which is understood here as the desire to restore things to their place and to locate properly trans-ontological and ontological differences. This love I call, following Sheila Sandoval, decolonial. Now, close quote. What Fanon adds to Levinas' analysis is the extent to which the evil that Levinas found in fascism have already existed and continue to exist in modern European colonialism. And this opens up the question about the relationship between European modernity, colonialism, and anti-blackness. And B, the extent to which this systematic violence begets not only structural conditions of violence that damage subjects from the outside, but systematic violence and indeed torture that has the effect of internalizing the violence to the point that a subject is produced whose existence is invested in their own annihilation. That is the violence against not only from the outside, you receive it from some outside force towards your body, but the violence ultimately through torture and different forms of violence, the violence is internalized and you create a self that is militating, is at war with itself, is militating against itself. And that's suggesting that that's a way to approach reading Black and White Masks, which is Fanon's first book, right? And if so, then you can see that Fanon, the psychiatrist, if he is trying to diagnose, to understand this war of a self that is annihilating in the project of killing itself, then he's engaged. His search for health or healing is a search for peace, the end of war, and for peace. Now, against war in the text is meant as a paradigm, and it refers to the naturalization of war, and that includes the use of rape and torture as weapons of colonization in the wars of colonization. Also, the argument is that this paradigm of war is inbuilt in modernity coloniality, it informs it, it's like its darker side, if you will, and includes internal war of subjects, the internal war of subjects who are compelled to kill themselves, as I just mentioned. Now, from this follows a number of points One is that the analysis of the ways in which warring practices of war, are inscribed not only in colonial relations, but also in the very ideas and ideals of Western modern civilization. That this affects the colonized as well as the colonizer, right? How these ideas and practices of war become embedded in the normative concepts. MSSR brilliantly commented on how the colonizers do not civilize the colonized, but rather decivilize themselves in the process of colonization. So no one, right? It's not only the colonized who has internalized some grave condition out of this context, the colonizer has too. Which ultimately for Césaire, and actually Du Bois even saw this before Césaire, this already creates a context where you can see how the colonizers will turn against themselves and engage in some of the same practices that they mobilize in the colonial world. Now, also this view of war called for an analysis of the coloniality of being, starting with the damnés or condemned as subjects who are compelled to kill themselves and each other, but also of damnation as a place where the impossible can happen. The impossible being the formation of something else beyond that logic of self-annihilation. So that leads to the other point, which is that the analysis calls for an exploration of the sources for peaceful existence and coexistence in the context of catastrophe. And thinking about this state of affairs where war is a paradigm as a catastrophic state of affairs. And what is there is a critical conversation with the tradition of phenomenology and the work of Edmund Husserl, referring to the crisis of the European sciences. And shifting the ground, and I think that Fanon and Césaire shift the ground from crisis to catastrophe. And the catastrophe is linked with these practices of war making. For Levinas, the sources for peaceful coexistence and existence were found in what he called ordinary social life. Eros, and Levinas focused on eros and communication. That's why Levinas, one of his early writings, is a phenomenology of eros, of the erotic experience. And he also believed that in dialogue, in communication, there, in these concrete, very concrete, ordinary relations, there you can find the trace of this for the other, of being for the other, that is constitutive of subjectivity. Now, I suggest that this allows for a very productive and I think generative connection with Fanon, because the first chapters in Fanon Blaskin White Mass focus on language, which has to do with dialogue, with knowledge and love. So in a way, you can see Fanon saying that the modernity has skewed the conditions, even the ordinary conditions of love and communication become impossible in the colonial context when you have subjects that are trained to annihilate themselves and each other. So in that context, love never is achieved, is never achieved, and communication is not achieved because the colonized, instead of really opening themselves to others, they are using language as a way to appear as one to the other. So it's not about an encounter with another, it's about submission to a master. And the master is already encoded in your mind. So in a way, you can see that Fanon was intervening in that kind of landscape of reflection, bringing up the relevance of anti-blackness and coloniality for how we think about these things. So Fanon was a psychiatrist and a doctor. And so he was also interested in the cure of this kind of subjectivity and this kind of condition. So he was trying to identify how our own views of ourselves might be caught in the colonial matrix of power, knowledge, and being. He was also taking seriously, but not romanticizing, our efforts to survive and aspire and fight for decolonization, even in the context of survival. He was trying to argue for that. And he was arguing for the importance of the collective nature of decolonization. So if Levinas saw the sources for peace in ordinary social life, Fanon found them in the formation of collectives that aim to counter coloniality, where then love and understanding eros and communication can take a new shape because encounters between selves and others are actually taking place. The colonial movement the colonial movements can then be understood as spaces or sites of the colonial peace, places where love and understanding can emerge, and they emerge in the context of struggle. This can be overt, but also embedded in practices of living and within religious discourses and traditions. So we're not talking necessarily of self-conscious, organized collectives, but about dynamics that erode the coloniality of being, power, and knowledge, and that allow subjects to encounter each other and to access the space of the erotic and the space of knowledge and understanding beyond these masks that are impossible. In these spaces, there are no clean hands and there is no purity either. So don't look for perfection in any of these spaces. But Fanon suggested that the impossible can and does happen. It is significant that Plastic White Mask concludes with Fanon elevating a prayer to his body to make him someone who questions. And already in sort of one of the works that I am been developing gradually is a phenomenology of the prayer. And then looking at how it's so fundamental to understand that subjectivity at the end. Actually, a little bit of this is announced in the essay that we're going to be discussing tomorrow, the question of the notion of the prayer and how important it is to understand Fanon, and also to understand maybe what would be Fanonian intervention into the discourse of human rights and declaration of human rights, because the declaration is another form of discourse, right, than the prayer. So this gives you this is where, in a way, it's coming from when in 2020, I decided to re-engage with the topic of peace and justice again. And let me give you, so I'm going to transition to that other part. So the reflection on peace, and I wrote a piece that circulated in various kind of websites, including the Black Agenda report. But this was in the context that Donald Trump emerged early on, since even before he became president, as the law and order candidate. Right? And it started with his coming down from the escalators when he was going to announce his presidency, and in a way targeting these kind of Mexicans, nasty hombres that were coming from the south, right? And so he was the law and order. He was going to bring law and order to the cities, to the border, right, to the states. He was going to stop all this disorder and unlawfulness. And also, he later he referred to Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization. It's a terrorist, right? So again, law and order are being mobilized very clearly, in a very plain and clear, violent, racist, colonialist direction. Now, the Republicans, by and large, I think, typically, would be interested to have a study, but it seems that this struck a nerve. This is not new either. This appeal to the discourse of law and order. Right? So that struck a chord, and that kept there and defined much of the Republican field. Now, Democrats counter, and this is politics, right? If you come out with law and order, what are you going to say against law and order in the context of US politics? Well, Biden and the Democrats then came out. No, they didn't mention law and order. They mentioned justice. What we want is justice. Now, the president of the settler colonial state, that is the United States, is mobilizing justice. What kind of justice is that he's thinking about? What does justice mean when it can be mobilized in that context? And both Republicans and Democrats were in unison in wanting something. The Republicans wanted law and order, Democrats wanted justice, and indicated a close, more proximity to Black Lives Matter, but not a whole lot either. But they both wanted peace. Peace was the one thing that they both wanted. That they both, was particularly when the Black Lives Matter, when there were mobilizations that involved damage of property, and then both clearly, immediately, the notion of peace was mobilized. Everyone at peace, everyone. And when you heard the media, all the reporters and so on is like, do you want peace in our streets, right? Like everyone, as a condemnation probably of the movement. And this is why, it kind of wrote that column in 2020. Now, my argument was more or less that this appeal to justice by the Democrats and ultimately, by peace ultimately, but if you think about justice and peace, that they presuppose this peace and justice, the achievements of the law and order of the colonial settler state. That is, you could mobilize them in some way, particularly justice against law and order, but that justice is already premised on the fundamentals of the law and order of the nation state. So you are really not saying something dramatically different when you're saying justice in comparison to law and order. And settler colonialism, the nation is the achievement, and supposedly peace is meant to be the lack of disturbance to the order of the colonial settler state. That's why property cannot be damaged. You're protecting the order of the colonial settler state. So law and order were the means by which the nation state translated the systematic stealing of lands into property rights. That's not fair. From violence, naturalization of war into property rights, the regime of property also of land as property in the states. Now, once you accept those givens, you can refer to justice and peace as much as you want, but you are still presupposing the validation of the fundamentals of that brutal form of violence and that catastrophe. Now, the second example that I would like to present to you, or sharing and thinking together, has to do with ethics. That's where the ethnic studies connection comes about. And so, this is a yet unpublished article that I had the privilege to co-author with Samuel Bañales, Liz Lee, Sangani Yogi, Albert Ponce, and Sandy Sibejadebe. And these authors, all of us are academic leaders and organizers who specialize in various forms of race and ethnic studies. Two of the authors, Bañales and Oliver, teach and have leadership positions in ethnic studies areas, specifically ethnic studies and American Indian studies at California State University. Sangani Yogi and Albert Ponce co-direct the social justice program at Diablo Valley College in California, that is a community college, where they also are part of the movement for ethnic studies. And they infuse social studies with an ethnic studies approach while arguing for the need for the separate and robust ethnic studies unit and for an ethnic studies requirement. And then Sandy Hadebe and myself are scholars of Black consciousness and decoloniality, engaging conversations and collaborations that explore the connections between ethnic studies in the US and the struggle for free and decolonized education in South Africa. While these protests took place, the one that you saw in the US in the late 1960s, in South Africa, you found similar protests in 2015 and 2016. And they explicitly mobilized. Imagine how many decades later, there are another very strong, colonial settler state where apartheid, like in the US, was formalized. It's not by accident that you find students of color and Black students, particularly Black students, that are coming together to challenge their university space. But that's another talk. Now, let me tell you, I have a long text here. Let me see how I bring it down. This is part of the problematic what happened in around 2020. After 2014 in the university in California, the University of California public system is the largest such system in the US, the higher education system, with the community colleges, the California State Universities, and the University of California, right? Different campuses and systems. And so ethnic studies, again, emerged, was very powerful in California. Ethnic studies was, to that extent, very strong in the West Coast. Something says, where the East Coast was engaging, the power of divinity schools and religious studies, the West Coast was doing the ethnic studies revolutions. It's not entirely, true, but there is something of that. So in 2014, in response to the questions of systemic racism, ethnic studies faculty from multiple campuses and spaces came together and they formed a council. And they produced a report where, among other things, they recommended the creation of ethnic studies general requirement for all students to take in the California State University system. All students to take. They thought that that was important to address systemic racism, right? 2014. So basically what happens is then is you find, and the paper goes through this, right? The responses from the administration. First, you try to put it aside, then you take it. But actually first, the ethnic studies, even the areas where they were electives were eliminated. And then there was a Congress person who had graduated, she had graduated from ethnic studies, Dr. Shirley Weber. She was a former African-American studies professor at San Diego State University, and she introduced a bill in 2019 that will require California State University to institute an ethnic studies graduation requirement. And so how that was met was then that the administration then came in, and there was an opposition because now they were saying as if this was coming from the outside. But in truth, the idea had already come from the inside, but it had to go from the outside because there was nothing, to do. And how the administration responded was to kind of water down any kind of view of ethnic studies and to pair it with social justice. So then it was going to become the ethnic studies and social justice, under the idea that social justice is really the broader, if you will, more mature umbrella where this can actually happen, that ethnic studies is too provincial. So how is it that in a context, social justice is mobilized against the organic effort to support and contribute to, to the struggle against systemic racism? Think about how justice then becomes a tool. The concept of justice and social justice becomes a tool to diffuse, to water down, to relativize the need to engage in ethnic studies that focus particularly in a number of groups that have been historically marginalized in the history of the states and the United States. So the paper offers this as an example of the coloniality of justice. How justice has a number of features, and the generality is such that it lends itself to be used to counter a specific anti-racist claims and a specific struggle for decolonization. And justice can become a refuge of white liberalism to appear as if it is assuming the response to and the project of fighting systemic racism, when in truth is making it more difficult to address systemic racism. And it's kind of disciplining and putting down and putting in their place other subjects, movements, and so on. So social justice then becomes injustice, the mistranslation of claims that come from social movements. So in the paper, we examine that the movement for Black Lives talks about justice, but it's not never only just justice. It's always a series of terms. Right? So it's a series of terms. And so in the paper, we said that when we talk about peace also, like we saw before, the concept of peace can be mobilized to counter the colonial movements. Right? So the paper reflects on this example and this condition, and then theoretically about what it means, the coloniality of peace and justice in this context. It turns out that Fanon did offer reflection about justice like that. And he said that in a way we live in a world where justice is fundamentally a white attribute. So be on the lookout whenever someone speaks of justice. There may be some whiteness connected to it. It can be mobilized to effectively counter and demote struggles, specific struggles for the emancipation, liberation of a specific form of people. I would not go into the time has, and I want to leave some time to discussion. And what I can do is when the paper appears, I think sometime this year, I can send you the reference and you can all read it. But let me then go to my conclusions. I mean, Fanon was just so ahead of his time in so many things. You realize when you look at what he was writing and thinking about it, like, yeah, I mean, we're witnessing now, but in a way, right? It was there all along, these uses and misuses of justice. Now, we don't say that they need to be abandoned, justice and peace, but let me see if I can bring that down in my conclusion. That the ideas are, one, that it is not enough to talk about peace or about justice. And here I want you to think both about what I said at the beginning in relation to Against War, the book, and so on, but also this other part. That it's not enough to talk about peace or about justice. And it is doubtful that they should occupy the centers of our concerns. They don't have to be abolished from our vocabulary, but they need to become part of a larger set of concepts that more directly tackle the catastrophe of modernity coloniality and the unfinished struggle for decoloniality. Decolonizing peace and justice is about introducing these terms not only to the large conceptual architecture of the discourse on decolonization, but also, more importantly, submitting them to the dynamics of the praxis of decoloniality. And this is where Sheila Sandoval's work is so wonderful, because all the time she is discussing how the movement of US third world women in their movement, in the mobilization, they demonstrate that they were engaging these concepts and ideas, but in a specific way, in the context of other concepts and within a larger logic and aspiration that was framed around decolonization. Right? So you can have talks about justice and peace, but if you don't do it within that dynamic of decolonization, they can be easily taken up to counter decolonization, precisely. So second, the decolonial praxis can include what is not some grand moment of revolution necessarily, and it does not refer to a pure or uncontaminated set of actions. Fanon sought to advance decolonization in the middle of a revolution, as well as in the psychiatric hospital too. And Catherine Walsh invited us to think about the cracks that emerge in the middle of concrete walls. So this praxis may be happening everywhere in one way or another. And then finally, I want to suggest that, usually we say, no justice, no peace. Different social movements, no justice, no peace. And I would suggest that this slogan goes in the right direction, but it's necessary to go further. And maybe a way to go further is that, because if it does not go forward, still no justice, no peace can still remain caught up in the logic of coloniality and supporting or presupposing the validity of the law and order of the nation state, of the modern colonial settled nation state. That if we want to keep it and to keep these terms, maybe we will have to think about saying that there is no peace without justice, and no justice without reparations, and no reparation of the self, of being, of the social fabric without decolonization. I leave it there.